I saw my wife sneak out with her lover through the back doors at the couple's dinner, so I ran. I ran not after her, but after myself, trying to escape the pain that scene caused. My body moved aimlessly, my feet finding the cold asphalt of the street while my mind bled inside. I don't know if it was the humiliation, the shock, or the abrupt shattering of everything I believed to be solid between us. I only know that there, the moment she slipped through that door, embracing the other man as if she had never belonged to me, something inside me died. Something that had been building for years, brick by brick, affection by affection, fidelity by fidelity. And yet, it took only 7 seconds, the time it took me to recognize her hurried footsteps, the curve of her neck, her muffled laugh, to understand that I had been betrayed. Not just betrayed physically, but emotionally dismantled by the one I swore to protect, by the one who claimed to love me. I returned home like a ghost, walking silently through the rooms that once held our history. Every corner of the house screamed her name. The silverware was still wet in the sink, the towel folded in a way only she could, the scent of her perfume clung to the sofa. And when she came in, feigning a silly delay in traffic, perhaps expecting an attack, a scandal, a scene, I offered none of that. I didn't want fake tears, nor memorized excuses. I simply wanted to preserve myself. I looked into her eyes and said, "My soul raw, you can keep him, I'll keep my peace." It wasn't strength. It was exhaustion. It was the cry of a man who loved so much, who now only wanted silence. I left that night determined not to return. Empty-handed, but with a less heavy heart. I slept in a cheap hotel, smelling of mold and loneliness, but for the first time in months, I slept. And, over time, I found my bearings again. It wasn't quick, it wasn't easy. There were nights when the pillow felt like a knife. Days when the memory of her loomed like a ghost in the city's storefronts, in the cafes we used to frequent. But, little by little, I rebuilt what was left of me. I saw myself reflected in other conversations, other smiles. I discovered I was still capable of loving. Loving truly. Without fear. And I found someone. Someone who didn't need to hide their phone beside me, someone who didn't make me feel small in silence. Someone who was there, whole, not for the adrenaline of the forbidden, but for the comfort of the possible. While I was learning to walk again, she was stumbling over her own mistakes. The lover who seemed to offer everything I wasn't, freedom, adventure, desire, turned out to be just another man searching for something momentary. He took her to the pinnacle of illusion and pushed her back without even looking back. One day, she came to me. Crying, devastated, her makeup smeared as if the world had ended. She asked to talk. She said she had made a mistake, that she now understood the value of everything we had. That time had shown who was truly by her side. That the empty nights spent with someone who never truly loved her only served to remind her of what she had lost. She talked about longing, about memories, about us. I listened to her. Not for her sake, but for mine. So that I wouldn't carry eternal hurt, so that my new story could begin cleanly. I said I forgave her, yes. But that forgiveness was a door that closes carefully, and never opens again. And I left. She was left with absence. I was left with freedom. But what she never knew, what no one knows to this day, is that her lover didn't just abandon her. He left her in the cruelest way possible, disappearing. No goodbyes, no arguments, no reasons. A suitcase, a ticket, and a dry message saying he'd moved to another country. No plans to return. No plans with her. She, who had traded everything for a promise. Now, she had no promises, no pride, no home. And yet, what destroyed her most was knowing that, even after all the time, even with all the tears, I wasn't waiting for her. That the place that had once been hers was now occupied by someone who never had to lie to be there. Because love isn't just about saying it. It's about sustaining love in times when it would be easier to run away. And when she ran away, she didn't just see the back of her lover waiting for her. She left behind a home, a love, and a man who would have weathered any storm for her. But life, indeed, knows how to exact its toll. And the toll came without warning, without anesthesia, with no chance of return. And sometimes I wonder, at what exact moment did she realize that what she lost would never return? Was it the night she woke up alone, searching for a body that was no longer beside her? Or when she tried to call and saw the number no longer worked? Maybe it was when she looked out the window and realized no one would come back for her. But if I had to guess, I'd say it was when she saw me from afar, smiling beside someone else. A light, genuine smile, the kind of smile that only exists when you love again without carrying the ruins of the past. There, she understood the true meaning of loss. But what she never knew, what she could never have imagined, was that there was a secret that night at the couple's dinner. Something that happened before she walked through those doors, something that could completely change the course of history, and that, to this day, she has never discovered. And that's where it all begins. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize and never condone any kind of betrayal. All the stories are fictional, but the feelings are real, and the lesson is clear: cheating destroys lives, corrodes homes, and takes a heavy toll on the soul. Prepare yourself for an intense, surprising, and deeply emotional story. Take a deep breath, what comes next will shake you. At first, everything about them seemed perfectly suited. Ethan was the kind of man who carried the world with a certain silence in his eyes, but with a heart that knew how to welcome. He had a quiet kindness, the kind that goes unannounced but is felt in small gestures, like when he held the door for strangers without expecting a thank you, or when he straightened her sheets every morning, even when he was late for work. He had steady hands, a reserved smile, and a way of listening that made anyone believe his words mattered. Emma, on the other hand, was a light in motion. She spoke with her hands, smiled with her eyes, and had that energy that transformed rooms. She arrived, and the atmosphere shifted. The two met at a casual dinner with friends, and from their first conversation, there was something there that seemed destined to be more than just a pleasant evening. Ethan was more introspective, observant, and was captivated by the way Emma spoke so passionately about everything, from old movies to trips she had yet to take. She, on the other hand, found herself drawn to his calmness, to the way he looked at her as she spoke, as if the world had slowed down for a few seconds. Their relationship started out smoothly, without exaggerated promises, but with a lot of presence. A Sunday in the park became an event. A late afternoon coffee became a ritual. Ethan's home gradually adapted to Emma's small changes. First came the books, then the pictures with motivational quotes, the plants on the porch, and finally, the Sunday mornings he always spent alone, now filled with burnt pancakes and her laughter trying to cook. They weren't perfect, but they had something rare: complicity. The differences between them didn't separate them, on the contrary, they seemed complementary. He brought ground, she, wings. And for the first few years, that was enough. The wedding was natural, almost organic. No fancy proposals or over-the-top parties. Just the two of them, surrounded by close friends, exchanging handwritten vows with simple, but powerful, promises. To care for each other even when it's hard. To choose to be by each other's side even on cloudy days. Vows that, at the time, seemed eternal. Their life together began with that raw beauty of someone who discovers themselves daily. Mistakes were addressed with dialogue, silences respected. They laughed together easily, but also knew how to remain silent without the silence hurting. In the first year, it felt like time was taking shape around them. They lived in a corner house, simple but full of life. There was a blue wall in the living room that Emma painted herself, insisting that color was needed in the place where dreams lived. There were photos scattered throughout the rooms, records of short trips, home-cooked dinners, intimate birthdays. Neighbors commented on how happy they seemed. Indeed, they were. At least, for a while. As the years passed, routine set in, as it does for everyone. Mornings were no longer always calm, weekends not always synchronized. Ethan began working more, involved in projects that required concentration. Emma, on the other hand, immersed herself in the world of social media and new friendship groups, finding there a kind of stimulation that no longer existed in her marriage. Small changes began to emerge. Before, she would wait for him for dinner. Later, she would say she had already eaten with her friends. He, in turn, noticed the changes, but attributed them to time, to the phases of life. After all couples go through adjustments. That's what he told himself whenever she arrived late, always with a new event, a new name to mention, new stories that no longer included him. Communication, once so fluid, became sporadic. Long conversations gave way to short, sometimes apathetic responses. But Ethan persisted. He planned trips, suggested dinners, proposed returning to that coffee shop where they'd started it all. Emma agreed, but almost always cancelled. There was always something more urgent, more exciting. But he was still there. Loving as he knew how, in his quiet, firm way. He still saw beauty in her even on days when she seemed distant. He cared for her even when he felt the space between them widening with each passing night. It was a love that endured, even without complete reciprocity. Especially because he believed that this was true love, lasting, even when the flame flickered. He believed that every fire needs to be rekindled from time to time. And he was willing. On Emma's side, emotions were more mixed. There were times when she found herself looking at him with genuine affection. After all, Ethan was good. Always had been. But along with the affection came a restlessness. A feeling that something was missing. Something she couldn't name. It was as if she'd lost a part of herself in the role of wife. As if the world they'd built, though beautiful, was too small for the desires she'd begun to nurture. It wasn't ingratitude. It was camouflaged dissatisfaction. She began to seek it out. Not in direct actions, but in thoughts. In silent comparisons. In messages that, at first, were harmless. And over time, they began to push the boundaries of what was expected of someone in a relationship. She told herself it was just a phase. That she was rediscovering her own identity. But deep down, she no longer saw herself as part of the us she'd sworn to protect. Ethan, despite sensing this distance, never confronted her directly. Not out of fear. But out of respect. He believed that giving her space was a way of showing love. He trusted that everything would fall into place again. That time, the same time that cooled, could also heal. Meanwhile, she lived between two worlds. The world he'd built with Ethan, with security, comfort, and affection. And the new world, still hazy, where she felt something she mistook for freedom. For passion. For life. It wasn't betrayal yet. But it was the fertile ground where she was beginning to drift emotionally apart. And Ethan, with all the sensitivity of someone in love, noticed, even without knowing how to name it. Her closest friends noticed the distance. Some even commented to Ethan about the change in her behavior. But he, always discreet, responded with a brief smile. "We're just going through a phase." Inside, he kept the questions, the fears, the suspicions he didn't dare put into words. And he carried on. Believing. Trying. Loving. With Emma, the doubts intensified. Sometimes, looking at him sleeping beside her, she felt a pang in her chest. Was it guilt? Was it longing for what they had been? Was it fear of what they would become if she continued on the path she was on? She herself didn't know. But she pushed these thoughts away whenever they appeared. Life was too full to deal with what she didn't want to face. They still shared the same roof, the same bed, the same keys. But their feelings were already beginning to drift in different directions. And although no major rupture had yet occurred, a silence was growing between them. A heavy silence that seeped into the walls of the house, into automatic gestures, into dinners where the cutlery was louder than the words. A silence that said more than any argument. A silence that announced that something was about to change, forever. The weeks dragged by in a routine that seemed to function only on the surface. Ethan continued to fulfill his role with the same serenity he always had, but his eyes no longer found the same light when they turned to Emma. He sensed, albeit silently, that she was growing more distant, and this distance wasn't measured only in physical absences, but in small gestures. Conversations that had previously been full of details were now brief and shallow. Nights no longer ended with long embraces, but with a hurried kiss on the cheek or, often, with her body turning to the other side of the bed before he could even approach. Ethan, however, insisted that true love required patience, and that if he held firm, she would eventually return. Emma, for her part, felt a silent emptiness growing inside her. She was restless, as if constantly searching for something she couldn't name. Dinners with friends became more frequent, laughter during phone conversations always happened when Ethan wasn't around, and her cell phone became an extension of her hands, jealously guarded, as if hiding something was her natural way of coping. He noticed. Oh, how he noticed. But he chose to believe it was just modernity, the way everyone lived now. Still, the weight of that change seeped into the walls of her home, transforming every small detail into a painful doubt. Ethan began to dedicate himself more to trying to reclaim what he believed was merely dormant. He brought her flowers without a special date, suggested short trips, and made her breakfast before leaving. In every gesture, there was a secret hope that she would notice the effort, that she would say something, anything, that would confirm that there was still an us. But the response was almost always silence, or a polite smile, the kind that hurts more than it comforts. Emma lived in a parallel world, divided between the stability Ethan offered and the electrifying feeling of being discovered by something new, something that had been growing in secret and that she nurtured like a forbidden flame. The messages she exchanged at unlikely times were no longer just banal conversations. They were confidences, veiled promises, laughter Ethan would never hear. Her heart raced when she read those words, and this contrast with her husband's serenity confused her. Deep inside, Emma believed she was experiencing a kind of rebirth, as if rediscovering who she was before she was a wife, before carrying the weight of a life built on routine. Every time her phone vibrated, a shiver ran down her spine. And every time Ethan held her, guilt crept in, whispering silently, but drowned out by the adrenaline of newness. Ethan sensed the growing distance, but he didn't speak. His silence wasn't one of indifference, it was one of fear. He feared that by naming what was happening, he might confirm the pain he already suspected. One night, he gathered his strength and tried to talk. He prepared a simple dinner at home, played her favorite music, poured wine, and when they sat at the table, he asked if everything was okay, if something was wrong, if she needed him in a different way. Emma smiled with her lips, but not with her eyes, and answered evasively. She said she was just tired, that it was routine. He accepted it, but deep down, the answer pierced him like a blade. His heart knew what her mouth would never say. The following days only confirmed her suspicions. Emma began to dress more carefully for going out, even when she claimed it was just a quick get-together with friends. She sprayed on perfume before leaving, checked her makeup in the mirror, and when Ethan asked where she was going, she answered quickly, without elaborating. And then came the late-night arrivals, accompanied by rehearsed excuses, justifications that always sounded cold. Ethan kept his questions to himself, but with each silence he chose, he felt himself losing another shred of his dignity. Even so, he believed that giving in was the way to avoid losing what he loved forever. Then came the couple's dinner. An event that brought together old friends, people who had known the two early in their relationship. It was a night to celebrate friendships, memories, and bonds. Ethan dressed carefully, not only for the occasion, but out of a desire to recapture, that night, something of the essence of who they were. Emma also prepared herself, dressing with the same dedication as before, but there was something different in her gaze. While he sought to relive memories, she carried in her body the expectation of experiencing something else, something that had nothing to do with that gathering. Dinner started lively, with conversations, laughter, and stories from the past. Ethan felt part of something he hadn't felt in a long time. He watched Emma smiling, participating in the conversations, and for a moment he believed things could go back to the way they were. But as the glasses filled and the laughter echoed, he noticed a detail he couldn't ignore. Emma was receiving messages on her phone and looked away whenever the screen lit up. His heart raced, but he pretended not to notice. He tried to focus on his friends, the conversations, the moment. Until, amid the noise of the restaurant, he saw something he would never be able to erase from his memory. While everyone was distracted, Emma discreetly stood up, saying she needed some air. Ethan, intrigued, followed her movement with his eyes. He watched her move toward the back of the room, glanced around to make sure she wasn't being observed, and walked through a side door. Time seemed to slow down. In a matter of seconds, what had been doubt turned into cruel certainty. On the other side of that door, a man was waiting for her. The hug was quick but intense. The kind of hug you don't give to a friend, or even an acquaintance. And then, the muffled laugh that echoed was like a shrapnel piercing Ethan's chest. He didn't make a sound, didn't call out, didn't run. He just felt his heart shatter silently, as if the entire weight of years had fallen on his shoulders at once. The world continued to spin around him, his friends continued to laugh and toast, but for him, everything stopped at that scene. What he had always feared but never dared to acknowledge was now before his eyes. Emma had walked through a door, and in doing so, she had also crossed the line between loyalty and betrayal. Ethan sat there, staring at the wineglass in front of him, trying to breathe, trying to understand how life could change in seconds. Dinner continued, but within him there was only the deafening silence of disappointment. A silence that held the promise that nothing would ever be the same again. And that night, the moment Emma disappeared into the back of the restaurant, Ethan didn't know it yet, but the world he knew had ended. And something much bigger, much more devastating, was about to be revealed. The morning after dinner, Ethan woke up unsure if he'd slept or simply spent hours with his eyes closed, trying to silence the pain spreading inside. The scene from the previous night wouldn't leave his mind, replaying itself like a broken film, always showing the same scene, her embrace with another man, the muffled laughter, the escape through the back door, as if the love they'd built were disposable, as if his years of dedication were merely a backdrop to the story she now chose to live. He got up without saying a word. Emma was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee with a serenity that made him doubt she was truly there that night. When he passed her, he simply said he needed to leave, that he needed to think. And she didn't ask where he was going. She didn't try to stop him. She simply nodded with an empty gesture, as if she'd already accepted the separation, unaware that it came with the weight of a farewell about to form. Throughout the day, Ethan walked through places they both used to frequent. It was a kind of internal farewell, a silent ritual. He needed to understand where everything had begun to fall apart, and even more so, he needed to understand where he had lost himself in the process of keeping it alive alone. He considered confronting her, spilling everything, asking her when their love had stopped being enough, but deep down, something inside him urged calm. He didn't want empty answers, he wanted clarity. He wanted to understand the extent of the damage before deciding what to do with the wreckage. Early that evening, he returned home to find her on the couch, her phone in hand, her mind elsewhere. She looked at him with a mixture of relief and discomfort, as if she'd expected this but wasn't sure how to react. Ethan took a deep breath, sat across from her, and for the first time, didn't try to sugarcoat what he felt. He firmly told her that he knew. That he saw. That he didn't need explanations for what was obvious. She hesitated, tried to deny it, but her eyes gave him away before any words could come out. Then she lowered her head, and for the first time in a long time, she fell silent. The silence that had once been comfortable was now cruel. He didn't yell. He didn't slam doors. He just said he had to go, that this wasn't home anymore. She cried, not because she'd been kicked out, but because she realized he wouldn't beg, wouldn't ask her to stay, wouldn't fight for something she herself had destroyed. When he left, Emma felt the house collapse into silence. For the first time, the echo of her own footsteps on the cold hallway floor sounded like a warning of what was to come. She tried calling the other man that same night. No answer. In the following days, more attempts. Calls, texts, notes left. All without return. She began to feel the unease growing like a knot in her stomach. Something was wrong. He always responded. Always had a ready excuse, a quick justification. But now, silence. The following week, she decided to go to his apartment. She knew the route by heart, she'd been there many times in secret, when Ethan thought she was at work or with friends. She rang the doorbell 2, 3 times. Nothing. She knocked on the door. She called his name. A neighbor passed by in the hallway and watched her with a strange look, as if he knew too much. Emma asked if he still lived there. The neighbor replied matter-of-factly, he'd left a few days ago, sold everything quickly, said he was leaving the country, that he needed to get away from everything. Her body felt cold. She called again, texted with a tone that vacillated between desperation and pleading. Until a message, dry, to the point, and emotionless, arrived on her phone, I moved. It was getting too much. It wasn't meant to last. I hope you understand. Take care. Emma read that message dozens of times. There were no more commas than necessary, no extra words. No promises, no regrets, no real explanations. It was as if the whole affair had been just a miscalculation, a detour for him. And for her. It had been everything. It had been the reason for destroying a marriage, a home, a history. In the days that followed, Emma lived in a kind of emotional limbo. She tried to convince herself that freedom would come after the pain, but she only found more emptiness. People around her began to notice her lost expression. Friends who had shared a relationship with Ethan drifted away. No one wanted to take sides, but in the silence of others' decisions, she understood the consequences of her choices. She tried to reconnect with Ethan, but he didn't respond. Until, months later, upon learning he would be at a close friend's wedding, she decided to go too. She wanted to see him. She needed to know how he was. Perhaps she expected to find him hurt, fragile, broken like her. Perhaps he still believed there was room for reconciliation. She arrived at the event with barely concealed anxiety. Eyes searched every face for him. When she saw him, she felt something in her chest that she couldn't describe. Ethan was smiling. A real smile. Not the smile used to mask pain. He was walking hand in hand with a woman she didn't know. The two seemed complicit. They laughed softly, exchanging glances as if they understood each other in silence. Emma felt her legs weaken. That image hurt more than all the ignored messages, more than the other man's disappearance. It hurt because it revealed an undeniable truth: he had moved on. Later, when she managed to speak to him, her voice trembling, her eyes teary, she apologized. She said she regretted it. That what they had was precious. That she had made a mistake. Ethan listened calmly. There was no anger. Just a firm, weary, yet respectful look. He said he forgave them, yes. But that forgiveness was a gesture to free them both, not to mend what had been destroyed. He said he had learned, through the pain, what true love meant, and that now he was living it with someone who didn't need apologies, because she chose to be by his side even on the hard days. Emma tried to insist, to say she still remembered the good times, that she still loved him. But he just smiled, put his hand on her shoulder, and said he hoped that one day she, too, would love herself enough not to destroy what was precious for an empty promise. When he walked away, Emma felt, for the first time, the weight of loss in its most definitive form. It wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the end of her chance to redeem herself with the one who had once believed in her more than she believed in herself. She returned home with a broken heart. The apartment seemed bigger, colder, stranger. The photos that had once seemed like trophies of a busy social life now looked like empty frames. Her phone, which had once vibrated with messages that made her smile, was now just a silent object beside her bed. It was only days later, while sifting through her old emails, trying to recapture some memory of her lover, some clue that might explain his abrupt disappearance, that she discovered the truth that would completely unravel her. A digital receipt, forgotten in an inbox. A portion of a plane ticket. A destination name. And along with it, a booking confirmation for 2 people. There was no mistaking what she was seeing. The trip he took, his escape from the country, wasn't an impulsive act. It was planned. And worst of all, it wasn't planned with her. There was another name on the reservation. A woman. Someone he'd been in contact with for a long time. The dates matched the periods when he'd begun to pull away. She hadn't been betrayed by him. She'd been used. Replaced before she even realized it. And in that moment, all Emma had left was a single certainty: she had traded the truest love she'd ever known for a man who, in the end, used her as a springboard for another story. And that was a pain that not even time could erase. Emma spent the next few days in a daze. Discovering the other woman's name on the plane ticket, a woman she'd never heard mentioned, but who'd been by his side during the flight, occupying the space she believed was hers, torn apart what little remained of her self-esteem. Now everything made sense: the evasive tone in her last messages, the sudden coldness, the abrupt disappearance. She hadn't just been left aside. She'd been replaced, discarded, ignored by someone to whom she'd given not only her body but also her soul. And worst of all, replaced by someone who didn't even bother to hide it. Emma found herself staring at her own reflection, trying to recognize herself there, but all she saw was a shadow of what she once was. Her gaze was heavy, her weary expression betrayed sleepless nights. She tried to escape the pain by maintaining her routine, but everything seemed to scream absence. The apartment where she lived alone had now become a minefield of memories. The bathroom mirror still had the steam mark where he used to draw hearts, the sofa still held the scent of the perfume she used to find him, the bed, once the place where she felt alive, was now just the place where loneliness rested. She tried to erase the messages, the photos, the traces, as if erasing the evidence could also erase the feelings. But the pain wouldn't obey commands. It was everywhere. In the smell of coffee, in the music playing in the elevator, in the similar faces she met on the street. One day, wandering aimlessly, Emma sat on a park bench and cried silently, surrounded by people who passed by without noticing, or perhaps simply didn't want to notice. For the first time, she wished she could go back in time. Not to change someone else's steps, but to change her own. She felt like she had given up the only true love she had ever had. Ethan wasn't just a good man. He was her home. And now, that home belonged to someone else. There was no going back. Months passed. The seasons changed. Her hair was different, her face paler, her smiles more restrained. She decided, then, to meet him again. Not to ask him back. It wasn't for that anymore. It was for you. I wanted to apologize in the most human way possible, not out of wounded pride, but out of genuine repentance. I knew I wouldn't be welcome. She knew she risked being ignored. But I had to try. I learned from mutual friends that he now lived in another neighborhood, in a house further away, where he was starting a new life. I also learned that he was with someone. I didn't know who the woman was, but I'd heard she was sweet, calm, and good for him. The idea of seeing him happy with someone else hurt, but there was something inside her that still felt relief. He deserved this. Much more than anything she was capable of giving. The afternoon was chilly when Emma arrived in front of Ethan's new house. The facade was simple but welcoming. There were potted plants on the porch and light curtains on the windows. He took a deep breath before knocking on the door. I didn't know if he would open it. I didn't know what to say when he did. When the door opened, time seemed to stand still for a few seconds. He stared at her with a calm but watchful gaze, as if he no longer expected anything but also didn't want war. She didn't smile. Neither did he. But the silence that fell there was different from all the previous ones, it was the silence of truth. "I didn't come to ask you to come back," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I came because I needed to look into your eyes and tell you I'm sorry. For everything. For the lies, for the absences, for leaving you alone even though I was by your side." Ethan didn't answer right away. He simply opened the door a little wider and gestured for her to enter. The inside of the house was even calmer than she'd imagined. There was a scent of lavender in the air, soft music playing in the background. Discreet travel photos, books on the bookshelf, a blanket folded on the sofa. It was a place that overflowed with peace, the same peace he'd sought when he'd said he'd stay with her, not with the pain. She sat without removing her coat, her cold hands clasped in her lap. He remained standing, watching. "I thought I knew what I wanted," Emma continued. "I thought the life we had was too small. That I needed more intensity, more emotion. But after I lost everything, I understood that what we had was rare. It was love in its purest form. A love I threw away trying to live something that only existed in my head." Ethan sat across from her, his eyes locked with hers. "You didn't lose everything, Emma," he said, his tone almost a whisper. "You lost me. And that's not all. It's just a part of your life. Maybe the most valuable, yes. But you still have a chance to rebuild yourself. Just not here." She let the tears flow unhurriedly. There was no shame anymore. There was acceptance. Ethan didn't seem moved by grief, but by maturity. It was as if, somewhere deep inside him, he had mourned this long ago. "You were the purest love I've ever known," she said, her tone almost childlike. "And maybe that's what hurts the most. Knowing I destroyed it with my own hands." He took a deep breath, as if struggling to maintain his composure. "I loved you too. With everything I had. But today, I love someone who looks at me as if every day by my side was a choice, not an obligation. I needed to lose you to allow myself to be found." The door opened. The woman Ethan was with came in with a shopping bag and smiled at the sight of him. When she saw Emma, the smile faded, but didn't disappear. She was pretty in a light, understated way. Emma stood, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and muttered, "I was just leaving." The woman simply nodded and went inside. Emma looked at Ethan one last time. "Thank you for listening to me," she said. "And for not hating me." He walked her to the door. "Hate is just another way of holding on to someone. And I chose to let go." As she left the house, Emma felt the weight of reality settle on her chest. For the first time, she understood there was no going back, no more bridges to rebuild. What remained was the lonely path of regret, and the responsibility of learning to live with it. Of all the punishments, this was the cruelest, watching from afar the happiness she herself had given away. And knowing that no matter how hard she tried, she would never again be invited to be a part of it. The house was left behind, but the memory of that encounter would never leave her. Ethan had given her something she hadn't expected, peace. A kind of peace that wasn't a convenient forgiveness, but a complete liberation. And with that, he didn't just move on, he left her behind forever. Emma was now just a page turned in a book that continued to be written by other hands, with other stories, with a love that, this time, knew how to be reciprocated from the first chapter. And that was the final lesson. No matter how much a heart beats for someone, if it isn't truly cared for, it finds another place to live. And when it leaves, it doesn't come back. Emma walked the streets without looking to either side, simply following her own steps, as if escaping the image of Ethan slowly closing the door behind her were possible. The afternoon fog swallowed the contours of the sidewalks and gave the city an even heavier appearance, as if everything around her was also mourning something. The air seemed thicker, and each breath hurt, as if the world were slowly crumbling inside her chest. The sounds of cars, people, birds, everything sounded distant, muffled, as if she'd been separated from reality by an invisible layer of regret. His goodbye had been gentle, but definitive. And the other woman's serene presence in the house, natural, without needing to mark her territory, just being, that was the hardest wound to face. It was the certainty that she had been replaced not by someone better, but by someone who knew how to value what she herself had wasted. The days that followed were long, silent, and unbearably stable. The pain, unlike the one she'd felt when her lover abandoned her, now had deeper roots. It wasn't just her wounded ego, but her soul. It was the recognition that she'd made choices that had led her to exactly where she was, alone, devoid of excuses, facing the reflection of her own error with each new dawn. No attempt at distraction worked. Not social media, not brief coffee breaks in new places. Everything around her seemed to conspire to remind her of what she'd let slip. He began to decline invitations, isolate himself, respond to messages late, or simply not respond at all. Not out of arrogance, but out of exhaustion. There were days when the simple act of existing demanded more energy than she could offer. Her heart, previously restless for novelty, now shrank at the sound of her own conscience. Ethan, on the other hand, was experiencing the opposite process. The pain of discovery and loss had been overcome not with haste, but with presence. He dedicated himself to the new relationship with a care that didn't stem from a need to prove anything, but from silent gratitude for having been found by someone who saw him completely. The love that now filled his life was different. There was no uncontrolled euphoria, no gaps filled with promises. There was construction. Dialogues that didn't shy away from discomfort. Small gestures that, together, built a space where he could breathe without fear of being forgotten. He still carried memories of the past, of course. No one survives the end of a long story without scars. But now, those marks served as reminders of who he was, what he had learned, and, most importantly, what he would never accept again. Ethan's new partner didn't ask unnecessary questions about the past. She noticed his silences, respected his moments of withdrawal, and offered her presence without pressure. The relationship grew at its own pace, without urgency, and with a maturity he had never experienced before. Little by little, he began to realize that being with someone didn't have to be a perpetual struggle to prove love. Love, when it's real, manifests itself naturally, without competition, without games. And this made him feel free, not in the sense of doing whatever he wanted, but in the sense of being able to be himself, without fear of being left again. Emma, on the other hand, began to experience a profound, almost moral dilemma. She began to question who she had become in recent years, what had motivated her to lose everything. She knew she had hurt someone who truly loved her, and this prevented her from moving forward with ease. She sought therapy, trying to understand her own choices, the patterns she repeated, the shortcomings she masked with impulses. In the process, she discovered an Emma she had long ignored, an insecure woman who confused freedom with ego, who couldn't accept love because, deep down, she believed she didn't deserve it. And that was the hardest part to face. It wasn't the other person's mistakes that had led her to this point, but her own. It was easy to blame the world, fate, circumstances. What was truly difficult was accepting that, faced with the chance to have a full and loving life, she chose the abyss. The nights were the cruelest. The bed seemed bigger, the room colder. She remembered how Ethan would tuck her in when she slept on her side, how he'd leave notes on Monday mornings, how he'd remember every friend's birthday. They were small things, but now they were everything. And as much as she longed to erase the pain, she knew she needed to feel it until the end. Not because she deserved to suffer, but because she needed to honestly understand the consequences of what she'd done. Suffering, at that point, wasn't punishment. It was transformation. One day, while walking through a park where she and Ethan used to go on Sundays, Emma saw a scene that paralyzed her. A couple walked hand in hand, laughing at something only they knew. Beside them, a dog ran free, circling around them. Emma stood there, watching. And for a second, she saw in that couple what she and Ethan could have been if they had made different choices. She didn't recognize them, didn't know who they were, but the reflection of that possibility hurt, as if she were looking at a parallel version of her own life. And it was on that day that she made the hardest decision, to move on. Not as someone trying to forget, but as someone accepting that pain will be with her for a while, and that even with it, she must move on. She decided to move house. She sold her apartment and rented a smaller, simpler place, but one that didn't have the same walls steeped in memories. She changed her haircut, changed her daily routine. Not to reinvent herself artificially, but to create space for something new within herself. And, little by little, this choice began to make a difference. I no longer woke up every day feeling the same way. She began going out more, resuming old projects, reconnecting with friends she'd forgotten. There was still pain, of course, but there were also new meanings. Emma understood that missing someone didn't have to be a punishment. It could be a reminder of what was once important. And with time, what hurt stops bleeding and just throbs softly, as if to say, "Learn from me." As for Ethan, he continued his new life with serenity. He still dreamed of the future, but in no rush to get there. He lived each day as a small victory, and in the eyes of the woman beside him, he found confirmation that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He no longer felt anger about the past, nor fear of repeating it. He felt only gratitude for having emerged intact from the storm and, above all, for having found someone who walked beside him, not wanting to erase the scars of the road, but simply holding his hand firmly so he would no longer have to walk alone. Their story, now, was no longer made of encounters, but of learning. And even without contact, even without new words, Emma knew that, somehow, she remained present in Ethan's life, not as a threat, but as a lesson. The pain she caused taught him to choose better, to prioritize himself, to understand that true love cannot survive where there is no truth. And she, in turn, learned that true love requires courage, care, and presence. That the thrill of the new isn't always worth more than the beauty of what you already have. And that when you lose someone who loves you sincerely, time doesn't come back to offer a second chance. Because some doors, once closed, never open again. And with that, time moved on. Silent, relentless, but fair. Because in the end, everyone reaps what they sow, and what lies ahead, now, will not be about guilt or punishment, but about how life, even after everything, always finds a way to end stories with the truth they deserve. Winter was approaching, and with it came a dense melancholy that seemed to permeate the streets, the shop windows, even the hurried faces passing by with their coats closed and their eyes downcast. Emma, at that point in her life, no longer lived in the same rush as before. She had learned, the hard way, that answers lie not in the speed of things, but in the silence between one pain and the next. Her new apartment was small, with wide windows overlooking a tree-lined street, where orange leaves gathered in the constant wind. Everything there was new, walls, furniture, even the kitchen utensils, but she knew that newness alone healed nothing. What kept her going was the feeling of finally dealing with what she had previously ignored. The absence had stopped being loud. Now, it was a softer emptiness, as if it had already been acknowledged and, little by little, accepted. One afternoon, Emma received an unexpected call. It was from an old friend, someone who had drifted away when everything fell apart. The voice on the other end was careful, almost cautious, as if unsure whether to intrude or offer a hug from afar. The conversation was brief, but full of hidden meanings. The friend mentioned, affectionately, that she saw a change in her. Not just in appearance, but in the way she spoke, in her outlook on life. She said that Ethan had commented, days before, that he was grateful she hadn't tried to insist more than necessary. That he recognized her effort to rebuild her own life without invading his. Emma listened in silence. It touched her strangely, as if there were a kind of closure that came not from spoken words, but from respected actions. And when she hung up the phone, she sat for minutes, watching the sky darken beyond the window. A light rain was beginning to fall, washing the glass and, somehow, also washing something inside her. Weeks later, Emma decided to travel. He got in his car and drove to a small town, the kind with cobblestone streets and cafes where customers are called by name. He needed to get away from it all, not to escape, but to hear himself better. Once there, he rented a modest cottage on a quiet hill, where he spent his days reading, walking among the trees, and sometimes writing. She started a journal, not out of vanity or self-pity, but as a way to get out what still gnawed at her. She wrote about her choices, about the love she lost, about the woman she was and the woman she was trying to be. Each page was an intimate confession, a dialogue with her own conscience. One night, he wrote a letter to Ethan. Not to send, just to record. In the letter, he didn't apologize, nor did he try to get back together. He simply thanked her. For being patient, for truly loving, for leaving at the right time, and for not returning. She said he taught her the value of presence and the weight of absence. And now, I understood that love, when it's real, doesn't shout, doesn't pressure, doesn't beg. True love offers itself, and if it's not accepted, it leaves. And leaves in silence. While Emma was going through this discreet and profound healing process, Ethan was facing a new dilemma. The woman with whom he shared his new life was slowly beginning to feel the side effects of loving someone who still carried open scars. It wasn't distrust or insecurity. It was something more subtle. He was still present, kind, constant. But there were times when he lost himself in his own silence, in his own thoughts. And she noticed. One cold night, while they were both on the porch, wrapped in blankets, she commented carefully that she didn't know if he still loved his ex or just hadn't gotten over everything they'd been through. Ethan took a while to respond. He stared into the darkness of the street as if searching for the right words. "I don't love her anymore," she said finally, her tone firm but calm. "But what she did to me left its mark. I thought forgiving meant forgetting. But forgiving, in truth, is learning to live with the memories without letting them paralyze you. And sometimes, I still find myself trying to understand why I accepted so much silence, so much absence. I'm still cleaning the corners of myself that were soiled by that time. But that has nothing to do with how I feel about you." She nodded, understanding. She didn't ask him to forget, nor to erase the past. She simply held his hand, as she always did, and said she would be there while he rebuilt each broken part. And in that moment, Ethan understood the value of patient love. The kind of love that doesn't demand, but waits. That doesn't demand perfection, just presence. Some time later, by coincidence or fate, Emma and Ethan's paths crossed again. It was at a local art exhibition, where she had decided to go alone, seeking inspiration for her writing. When she entered the gallery, she didn't expect to find any familiar faces, much less this one. But there he was, standing before a navy blue canvas, his hands in his pockets and his eyes focused, as he always did when something truly touched him. For a moment, she hesitated. She wanted to turn and leave. But something inside made her stay. She walked slowly toward him, and when he noticed her presence, he looked at her with a restrained smile. This time, without pain, without anguish, without resentment. It was a smile of recognition. Like someone looking fondly at an old photograph and accepting that time has passed. They chatted briefly. About the exhibition, the weather, life. He told her he was working on a new project, that he was thinking about adopting a dog. She said she'd started writing, that she was thinking about publishing a book of short stories. They laughed together for a few seconds. And then, when silence fell, he looked into her eyes and said, with an honesty that pierced any defense, "You look good." She swallowed hard. Not because the sentence hurt, but because it was like hearing that, finally, she was in the right place. She nodded. "I'm trying to be." When they said goodbye, there were no long hugs or promises to stay in touch. Just a sincere wave and respect for everything that had been. And in that moment, Emma understood that not all endings are grand. Some are silent, small, but transformative. Because they seal peace where there was once war. Because they restore dignity to what was once only loss. And, above all, because they allow both of them to move forward with their hearts whole, even if scarred. On the way home, Emma reflected on how everything had changed. Not just outside of her, but inside. The woman now driving the streets wasn't the same woman who, months before, screamed for answers and wallowed in guilt. Now she knew that love isn't measured by what you feel, but by what you do with that feeling. And that sometimes, loving someone also means knowing how to let them go. Ethan moved on with his life with ease. He had learned, over time, to love again without carrying the debris of the past. And with each step, he honored not only those who were with him now, but also the version of himself who had the courage to start over. The dilemma between guilt and forgiveness had been resolved not with justice or revenge, but with humanity. Because in the end, the most remarkable stories aren't those that end with forced reconciliations or unrealistic twists. They're those that show, with brutal honesty, that every choice has a price. And that regret, even when genuine, isn't a return ticket. It's just the beginning of a long road called maturity. And that's exactly the path Emma was now walking. Unhurried to get there, unafraid of stumbling. Just with the clear knowledge that she would never again destroy something true in the name of an illusion. Because now, she knew. She knew that love requires courage. And that you don't always get a second chance to prove it. Months became years, and looking back, everything that once seemed urgent was now just a memory. Time doesn't erase what one has experienced, but it teaches us to look with distance and maturity. Ethan was living a new, consolidated phase, where the past was just a discrete trace in his story, no longer an open wound. He was building a serene life alongside someone who understood him effortlessly. The relationship was solid, based on truth, not on the need to prove anything to anyone. He had found not only a new love, but a new version of himself. A stronger, more lucid version, someone who learned that loving another should never mean abandoning oneself in the process. His home was now a space of peace, where silences comforted and glances said more than empty promises. He never spoke of Emma again, not out of hurt or contempt, but because his life no longer needed memories of her to move forward. The love he once felt turned into learning, and what remained of that was respect, the kind of respect that only those who have survived true pain are capable of offering to their own past. Emma, on the other hand, began to live with an absence that could never be filled. Despite all her efforts to rebuild her life, there was a void that no trip, book, or new experience could erase. It wasn't just about Ethan, it was about the woman she'd been when she lost him. Guilt no longer consumed her as brutally as before, but was now a constant, silent companion. She became more introspective, less impulsive, someone who learned not to place her happiness in the hands of others. She had friends, projects, even a few fleeting love interests, but there were no longer any illusions. She knew that some mistakes cannot be fixed and that some losses are permanent. What marked her most was the understanding that she hadn't been deceived, betrayed, or wronged. She had been the author of her own downfall, and accepting this required more strength than any grief. One day, while visiting a bookstore to attend a small literary event, Emma saw a book on the shelf with a discreet dedication, signed by Ethan. It wasn't about their story, but every line carried a trace of the sensitivity she knew so well. She flipped through a few pages and, without buying, left with a strange feeling, a mixture of pride and sadness. He had found a path she couldn't follow. That night, alone in her new apartment, she lit a candle, made tea, and wrote about him for the last time. A letter with no addressee. On the page, there was no request, no explicit remorse. There was, rather, an acknowledgement, she accepted, definitively, that the love she had lost would not return. And that her punishment wasn't to live unhappily, but to know that the happiness she once had wasn't enough to prevent her from losing herself. Years later, their paths never crossed again. Ethan married his new partner in an intimate, outdoor ceremony, surrounded by people who truly understood his pain and his resilience. The celebration was simple but rich with meaning. The vows exchanged promised not perfection, but truth. They chose to live in a secluded place, surrounded by nature, where time passed slowly and love didn't need to be proven every day, but was felt in every small gesture. Ethan became a father shortly thereafter, and holding his son in his arms for the first time, he felt something he had never felt before, a complete certainty that everything he had experienced, all the pain, all the loss, had prepared him for that moment. He no longer wanted to go back in time, because the present was enough. Emma followed everything from afar. She never snooped on social media, never sent messages, but sometimes she heard about him from third parties. When she learned of her son's birth, she remained silent. She didn't cry. She just smiled, as if she understood that life had moved on. She had moved on to him. And now, it was up to her to keep moving on too. One day, she gave an interview to a small channel that covered topics of emotional reconstruction. She didn't name names, but spoke about the choices that kept her from a great love. She said, with a sincere tone, that love isn't about momentary intensity, but about continuity. That betrayal begins long before the hidden kiss, it begins with neglect, silence, omission. And that no one destroys a relationship overnight, but rather little by little, each time they choose not to fight for it. Emma and Ethan's story ended not with screams or promises, but with the weight of reality. She lost. He moved on. And that didn't make them villains or saints. Just human. Each with their own choices, their own pain, and their own lessons. In the end, Emma's greatest punishment was having to live with the lucidity of what she destroyed. And Ethan's greatest reward was not letting bitterness shape who he was. He emerged from the darkness without a shadow. And that, in itself, was the greatest symbol of victory. If you've made it this far, leave your thoughts on this story in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts. What part resonated with you the most? Would you have forgiven? Would you have acted differently? If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel to continue following other intense, profound, and human narratives. Here, each story offers a lesson, not to judge, but to reflect on. And speaking of reflection, take this truth with you: betrayal doesn't begin with the act, but with the choice to not take care of what you have. It destroys more than trust. It destroys love, respect, plans, memories. It destroys families. And sometimes, it even destroys what's most valuable in someone: the ability to forgive themselves. So, take care. Preserve. Choose the truth. Because what is lost through betrayal often doesn't return. And when it does, it's no longer the same. Remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Here, the truth is always the way forward. Until the next story.